So if I am a crafty farmer, let's say that I plant my trees and my vines and my fields on the 28th of Tevet, which is the month that precedes Shvat. By the time the 15th of Shvat rolls around, that tree is now considered a year old, even though I only planted it 2 years before. So it actually decreases the amount of time that I have to have that tree in the ground or that vine planted before I can consider it for my own economic benefit. There's going to be another reason as well, which I'll talk about in a minute. Okay, so I want to talk to you about carob fruit. Some Jews eat the dried fruit of the carob tree on this day. And most of you know what carob fruit looks like. It is a long pod that is, not quite a boomerang shape, but curved, probably, 6, 8 inches long. And the fruit of that can be eaten. And it is said that it's associated with this holiday because it's said that Honi, who was a sage, wandered throughout the land planting carob trees, seeds. So this is kind of a Rip Van Winkle and Johnny Appleseed story combined. He planted these seeds, and carob trees take decades and decades to produce food. So God put Honi into a deep sleep to allow him to eventually wake up and see his own saplings from his own trees, and to be able to see the fruit that they had borne, because he wouldn't be able to do it in his lifetime. In fact, there's a very famous story about a young person who says to Honi, "You foolish old man, you're planting these trees. You will never live long enough to see the fruit of your labor." And to which Honi responded, "That's okay, because I plant not for myself, but for my children, for my grandchildren, and their children, and their children, and for all the generations going forward." Carob is supposed to be very high in nutrients. And there is a Talmudic story about a sage by the name of Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai, who was forced to hide from Roman persecution with his son in a cave. And they survived off of a carob tree and a stream of water for 13 years. Unfortunately, the sad part of that story is that this Roman persecution ended long before they came out of the cave. And when they found out, they were so distraught, they went back into the cave again. So, a strange story, but nevertheless, they survived on carob. Okay. Tu B'Shvat was not originally a festival, but the 15th of the month of Shvat became important for Jewish farmers in ancient times, because not only did they calculate when their fruit was going to be ready for them to consume and ready to sell, but they also calculated their taxes that way. If we read the book of Leviticus, it says that when you enter the land of Israel and plant any tree for food, you shall regard its fruit as forbidden. 3 years it shall be forbidden for you not to be eaten. Fruits were forbidden for the first 3 years of growth to eat, and the fruit of the fourth year was offered to the priests in the temple as a gift of gratitude for the bounty of the land. And the fifth year fruit and all subsequent fruit was finally for the farmer to eat and to enjoy. Tu B'Shvat, therefore, became known as the general birthday for all the trees. And that was when one would take an accounting of each tree as a year older and mark the time when the farmers not only could designate those trees as an opportunity for income for themselves, but also when they could finally eat their harvest and how much tax they had to pay. So taxes have been around a long time. As I talked about, we have 4 years in Judaism. Tu B'Shvat, believe it or not, falls at the close of the rainy season in Israel. And I've often thought that the weather here in San Diego mirrors the weather in Israel. It's very similar, particularly in Jerusalem, where you have these long, dry, hot summers. Sometimes it can be a bit humid, not as hot as it is in Tel Aviv, although you can jump in the ocean in Tel Aviv, or rather hotter than it is in Tel Aviv. But the rainy season is usually January, February, and the beginning of March, and it can be pretty cold and raw, and there can be snow. It's unusual, but there can be snow in Jerusalem. Not that we have snow here in San Diego, but what happens is the ground has become saturated with the rains. So now the fruit can begin to bloom. And this was the date that made sense to mark the start of the new season, even though it falls smack dab in the middle of the winter. The message of Tu B'Shvat is one of renewal and one of hope and so on and so forth. So we see trees beginning to bloom. The almond tree is the first tree in Israel that blooms. And if you've ever been in Israel when the almond trees are in bloom, it is absolutely gorgeous because they grow these pink flowers and the hillsides are just covered in trees with gorgeous pink flowers. And it's really quite spectacular. The Kabbalists in the Middle Ages, the Jewish mystics, were the ones who created the Tu B'Shvat Seder. The holiday, as I mentioned, is not a biblical holiday in terms of a celebration. The date was marked as a day on which your trees aged a year, but there was nothing in the Torah or the Bible that specifically says a way in which you celebrate it. That didn't come about until the Middle Ages, when the Kabbalists, who were the refugees, so to speak, those who had been ousted from Spain and Portugal and other countries in the Orient, other countries around that area, Morocco, so on and so forth, came to Israel and were a very spiritual bunch, and they developed a Tu B'Shvat Seder. And the Tu B'Shvat Seder mirrors the Pesach Seder in many ways, with 4 cups of wine, each representing a different season, and you're going to see this in just a moment. And with 4 different aspects of creation, according to the Jewish mystics of Kabbalah. The most common fruits that are eaten are, at a Tu B'Shvat Seder, are olives, grapes, figs, dates, and pomegranates. Olives, figs, dates, grapes, and pomegranates, those 5. Now, if you recall from Sukkot, we have something known as the Shivat Minim, the 7 species, but that includes 2 others, which are grains, which is wheat and barley. So because this is a festival that celebrates fruits of trees and vines, we don't include the wheat and the barley in that. It is just the 5 fruits: olives, grapes, dates, figs, and pomegranates. And I have some of that here, but not all of that here. COVID prevented me from doing any significant shopping for these items. Next year, God willing, we will have a community-wide Kabbalistic Seder for Tu B'Shvat. Okay. Fruit trees have a very special place in Judaism because that's how it all began, right? Began in the Garden of Eden with the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, which some people think was an apple tree, but it wasn't an apple tree because apples did not grow in that part of the ancient Near East. And it was more likely a pomegranate and not an apple. But in Jewish thought, fruit trees symbolize life, they symbolize growth and nourishment and so on. There's also a traditional image of a person as a tree whose arms and legs are branches that bear good deeds and the produce of one's labors. And that's a midrash that comes from Pirkei Avot, from the Mishnah. So it's this focus on the produce of the trees and the vines that get all the great hype during this holiday. It became a custom to plant trees in Israel on Tu B'Shvat, as I said at the very beginning of this presentation, with the establishment of the State of Israel. So 1948. And it actually happened on Tu B'Shvat in 1949, less than a year after David Ben-Gurion made a stopover for the first Knesset assembly, and he planted trees to honor the festival in Israel. So today, people commonly plant trees with several different nonprofit organizations and initiatives that plant trees in Israel. You plant for a loved one, you plant for in memory of somebody or in honor of something, and that person will receive a beautiful certificate, suitable for framing. And, it's kind of a running joke when you go to Israel and you go to where all the groves of trees are planted and you want to see your tree, unless you've planted thousands of them in one area, you're not going to get to see your tree. So I've actually had the pleasure of planting a few trees in Israel, not just virtually, but literally. And on my hands and knees, putting little saplings into the ground, which is just a wonderful experience. Once I did it in the JNF forest, Jewish National Fund, and the other time I did it in a marvelous place called Ne'ot Kedumim, which is a multi-acre nature preserve that grows all the fruits and plants that are mentioned in the Bible. And it's a fascinating place to go. You can have a meal there that's prepared with all the biblical foods and fruits and delicacies. Just a really incredible place. So I planted, I'm trying to remember what kind of a tree it was, and I don't recall, but I have a certificate from that as well, and photographs, and really wonderful experience. Okay. It was the custom of the famed Kabbalist, Rabbi Isaac Luria, who was the father of Kabbalah, so to speak, to eat 15 varieties of fruits on the 15th of Shvat. And 4 cups of wine is great. Add 15 different kinds of fruits to that, and it's even better. This last thing I want to tell you, well, actually, there's 2 more things. One of which is that in the book of Leviticus, we also read that we read about who it is who is mandated to go to battle if there is a war between Israel and another nation. And by that, I mean in ancient times. And it stipulates that if a young man is recently married and has not had time to harvest his first crops or his first orchards, fruits of the trees, or the first produce of his vines, he is not required to go into military service, which I think is really kind of fantastic, because when you think of all those people who got married, I hear stories all the time about people who married their sweetheart right before being shipped off to war, and sadly, some of them not returning and leaving very young widows. The Torah in Leviticus specifically states that if a young man has not yet built a home, harvested their fruits, or the grapes from their vines, they are not required to go into military service. So actually, they get to spend their at least 3 or 4 honeymoon type years with their new wife, which is a lovely thing to think about. Finally, and I love this custom, there's a custom to plant parsley seeds on Tu B'Shvat, because Parsley planted on Tu B'Shvat will sprout and mature in time to be used on the Passover Seder plate. So if you want to have parsley for Passover and you want parsley that you've yourself grown, plant it on Tu B'Shvat and you'll have a nice bunch of parsley for Pesach. So those are just some of the wonderful customs that come with this holiday. So I'm going to pause for just a second and come back to you, and we're going to do a modified Tu B'Shvat Seder.